Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. On a humid evening in the summer of 1067 within the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, a young woman named Isa was roused from sleep by invisible hands. She had lived 20 years, born Circassian, captured from her homeland at 12, purchased at Cairo's marketplace, and transported across the Mediterranean to become the Ottoman Sultan's servant. 8 years she had existed within these confines. Not once had she crossed beyond them. The hands belonged to a eunuch. His expression showed nothing. "Rise," he commanded, "get dressed." No explanation followed. Isa trailed him into the hallway and discovered it crowded with women, scores of them proceeding in identical direction, unshod feet against frigid tiles. Absolute silence maintained. The passage carried scents of rosewater and tallow from wall-mounted oil lamps, and underneath that some more ancient the mineral essence of stone perpetually hidden from daylight. She knew these faces. Layla, 17, from Georgia, whose knife flute performances had once earned the Sultan's applause. Fatma, 23, who had delivered the Sultan a daughter and received her own quarters plus wages her Abkhazian family would never learn about. Elderly Hadis, who had served the harem since the prior Sultan's era, and now laundered linens in the lower chambers, all advancing silently toward the courtyard. None informed why. In the courtyard, additional eunuchs stood waiting. They formed 2 lines, creating a pathway toward the exterior gate, the gate opening onto the terrace above the Bosphorus Strait. Isa had never passed through that gate. No harem woman ever did unless being transferred or freed, and transfers occurred during daytime with prop ceremony. This was midnight. Between the eunuch rows she observed something that paralyzed her. Canvas bags, scores of them stacked against the barrier, each sized to contain a human form. Beside the bags lay coiled rope. Beside the rope sat stones, heavy river stones, each matching a man's skull in size, arranged in precise rows as though someone had invested hours organizing them. Isa felt the blood drain from her features. She grasped now why the eunuch's face had revealed nothing. She grasped why silence reigned. She grasped why they'd been awakened in darkness rather than summoned in daylight. The surrounding women were beginning to comprehend as well. She detected breathing patterns, changing the ragged sound of wind, simultaneously realizing they hadn't been roused for ceremony or transfer or discipline. They had been awakened to perish. At the courtyard's distant end, beyond the bags and stones and ropes, stood the Kızlar Ağa, the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman Empire, the third most commanding official in the entire government, the man controlling every harem entrance and exit, the man determining which women the Sultan encountered and which women vanished. He held needle and thread in his grasp. He would personally stitch the first bag closed. But before revealing what transpired in that courtyard, I must take you backward, because what Ottoman sultans inflicted upon the women inside their harems wasn't a single act of insanity by one deranged ruler. It was infrastructure. It was constructed over centuries. It was sustained by empire. And the night Isa was shaken awake wasn't the horror's beginning. It was its conclusion. Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where we uncover the darkest truths history tried to bury. If you believe you understand how the Ottoman harem functioned, this video will transform your perspective. You're about to discover how young girls were abducted from their villages and sold into the Sultan's household, trained for years in the disciplines of obedience. How princes were confined in gilded cages with women who had been deliberately sterilized to prevent them from ever bearing offspring. How the empire's most powerful women poisoned and strangled one another for survival in a system, offering them precisely one route to power, and how one sultan, a man driven mad by 17 years of imprisonment, commanded 208 women be sewn into weighted bags and cast into the Bosphorus on a single evening. If this represents the kind of history they never taught in your classroom, subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians now, because this account only intensifies from here. To comprehend how such a monstrous system could exist, you must understand the man at its center. Sultan Ibrahim I was born in Constantinople on November 5, 615, the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed I and his consort Kösem Sultan. Kösem was Greek by birth, originally named Anastasia, sold into the harem as a girl and risen through intelligence and ruthlessness to become among the most formidable women in Ottoman history. She bore Ahmed multiple sons. This was simultaneously her greatest triumph and the source of everything that followed. In the Ottoman Empire, no law of primogeniture existed. Every son possessed equal claim to the throne. When a sultan died, his sons battled for power, and the victor strangled the losers with a silk bowstring since spilling royal blood was forbidden. Sultan Mehmed III had executed 19 of his brothers in a single day in 595, some mere infants carried to the executioner by their own nurses. The silk cord was the instrument of royal death in the Ottoman world, thin, strong, leaving no visible wound on the body. The executioners were deaf mutes, selected specifically because they couldn't hear the screams and couldn't repeat what they witnessed. To halt this cycle of mass fratricide, Sultan Ahmed I introduced a new system in Janissary. Instead of killing rival princes, he imprisoned them. The kaf is the cage. It was a suite of chambers deep within the harem at Topkapi Palace, decorated with painted ceilings and stained glass windows filtering sunlight into patterns of blue and gold, furnished with silk divans and embroidered textiles, guarded every hour of every day by eunuchs, standing motionless outside the single entrance. It resembled a palace apartment. It functioned as a prison. Princes entered the cafes as young as 7 or 8 years old and remained there until they either ascended the throne or died of old age. Some spent decades inside. When Sultan Suleiman II was finally released from the cafes in Texing Senan after 36 years of confinement, his first words were a question. "If my death has been commanded, say so. Since my childhood I have suffered 40 years of imprisonment." He didn't believe freedom was real. He assumed it was deception. The princes in the cage received tutors, servants, and food from the imperial kitchens. They also received concubines, but only women confirmed barren, because a prince in the cage was never permitted to father children. A rival heir with a son could threaten the dynasty. The concubines in the cafes served dual purpose. They provided companionship for men who had no other human contact, and they kept the princes occupied so they wouldn't plot rebellion. These women never departed. If one somehow became pregnant despite being chosen for infertility, she was immediately drowned in the Bosphorus by the eunuchs. No trial. No investigation. The eunuchs enforced this rule without exception. Ibrahim entered the cafes at age 8, when his older brother Murad IV took the throne in 603. Murad was brilliant, violent, and alcoholic. He banned coffee and alcohol throughout the empire and personally executed anyone caught drinking despite being a raging alcoholic himself. He once decapitated a musician who played a Persian melody he disliked. He forced harem women to jump into a pool and then fired pellets at their bodies. He had a group of singing women drowned in the Bosphorus because their voices disturbed his peace. Drowning was already the standard punishment for women who angered the sultan. Ibrahim didn't invent it, he inherited it, and one by one over the years, Murad strangled his brothers. He killed them in birth order, youngest to oldest, using the silk cord Ottoman custom prescribed, and each time Ibrahim heard the footsteps of executioners passing his door, he couldn't know whether they were coming for the brother next in line or for him. By the time Murad was finished, Ibrahim was the only male of the Ottoman dynasty left alive. He was spared not from mercy but from necessity. If Ibrahim died, the 600-year-old dynasty ended. Murad needed a spare. But Ibrahim didn't know he was safe. He had no way of knowing. Every morning he woke inside those beautiful painted chambers, wondering if the door would open to reveal a eunuch with a cord. Every night he fell asleep knowing his brother could change his mind at any moment. He fed fish in the palace pool with gold coins instead of food. He talked to walls. He screamed at shadows. Ibrahim spent 17 years in the cafes. 17 years behind walls he couldn't leave, surrounded by guards monitoring his every movement, attended by sterilized women and castrated men. Knowing that the only thing keeping him alive was the possibility that he might someday be useful. Modern psychologists studying the effects of prolonged solitary confinement have documented that isolation lasting more than 15 days can produce hallucinations, chronic anxiety, and permanent changes to brain structure. Ibrahim endured not 15 days but 17 years. His contemporaries had a simpler term for the result. They called him mad. When Murad died of cirrhosis at age 27 and height at 40, the Grand Vizier came to Ibrahim's door to inform him he was now Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Ibrahim refused to believe it. He thought it was a trick, the final cruel game before the silk cord tightened around his throat. He barricaded himself inside the cafes, pushing furniture against the door, and wouldn't come out. His mother Kosem came to the door and spoke to him through the wood, begging him to open it. He refused. Guards came. He refused. Ministers came. He refused. It was only when they carried Murad's corpse through the corridors of the harem and laid it outside Ibrahim's barricaded door for him to inspect through a crack in the wood that he finally slowly opened the door and touched the dead body with his own hands to confirm it was real. He was 24 years old. He had spent more than 2/3 of his life in a cage, and now he controlled an empire stretching from Baghdad to Vienna. with an army of hundreds of thousands, a treasury funding wars across 3 continents, and a harem containing nearly 300 women whose bodies and lives belonged entirely to him. Historian Noah Barber wrote that once on the throne, Ibrahim proved to be the most detestable and debauched of all the Ottoman sultans, but some modern historians, including Scott Rank, have suggested that Ibrahim's opponents spread rumors of insanity to justify his deposition, and that he may have been more incompetent than truly mad. The distinction matters less than you might think. Whether Ibrahim was clinically insane, or merely shattered beyond repair by decades of trauma, the result for the women in his harem was identical. The women in the harem didn't arrive by choice. Young girls of extraordinary beauty were sent to the Sultan's court as gifts from provincial governors seeking favor. Most were Caucasian, Georgian, or Abkhazian, taken from villages in the mountain regions between the Black Sea and the Caspian. They were bought at slave markets after being kidnapped from their families by armed raiders or sold by parents too impoverished to feed them during famines. The slave caravans moved through the Caucasus and across the Black Sea to Constantinople, and the journey killed many of the girls before they arrived. Those who survived were inspected on arrival at the palace by the Valide Sultan herself, or by senior harem women acting on her behalf. Girls who arrived at Topkapi were sorted into a hierarchy that would define the rest of their lives. Those considered plain became Kirai, the lowest rank, servant girls who cleaned, cooked, and laundered for the women above them. They lived in large dormitories beneath the apartments of the consorts, and slept on thin mats on stone floors. Those considered beautiful were placed on a different track entirely. They became potential concubines, and their training began immediately. They learned Turkish if they didn't already speak it. They memorized passages of the Quran. They were taught to belly dance, to recite classical Persian poetry from memory, to play the oud and the ney in the canon. They studied court etiquette under the supervision of the Kayakad and the head stewardess, who enforced discipline with beatings for any infraction. They were taught what the Ottoman sources called the arts of companionship, a set of skills designed to please the Sultan in his private chambers. The training took years. A girl might enter the harem at 12 and not be presented to the Sultan until she was 18 or 20, by which time she had been transformed from a kidnapped village child into a polished, multilingual, musically accomplished woman whose entire identity had been rebuilt around one purpose: the possibility that the Sultan might notice her. If the Sultan took a girl to his bed, her status changed overnight. She received her own chamber, her own servants, her own kitchen staff, a personal eunuch assigned exclusively to her, and a salary paid from the imperial treasury. If she became pregnant, she moved to larger apartments. If she bore a son, she became one of the most powerful people in the empire, because her son might one day sit on the throne, and if he did, she would rule beside him as Valide Sultan. If she bore a son, and that son eventually became Sultan, she became the queen mother, the supreme authority within the harem, with power over life and death for every woman inside its walls. This created a system where women had exactly one path to power, and that path ran through the Sultan's bedroom. The competition was lethal. It had to be. In a world where your son's survival depended on your influence, and your influence depended on the Sultan's favor, every other woman who shared his bed was not just a rival but an existential threat. Harem history is filled with women who clawed their way to the top and destroyed anyone who threatened their position. Mahidvaran Sultana mutilated the face of her rival Roxolana with her fingernails, tearing gashes so deep they left permanent scars. Gulbahar Sultana pushed a competing concubine named Gulbahar off a cliff. Hürrem Sultana was strangled in her own chambers. Bezamai Alim Sultana vanished one day and was never seen again. Her body never found, her fate never explained. Every glass of sherbet offered in the harem was potentially poisoned. Every friendship was potentially a trap. Every woman who smiled at you might be the woman who arranged your death. Now think about what happens when you place a man who spent 17 years in solitary confinement, who watched his brothers be murdered, who suffers from what modern clinicians would recognize as severe psychological damage, at the absolute center of this system, with no checks on his behavior whatsoever. Even before Ibrahim reached his worst, the drowning system was already operational in his household. Early in his reign, while he was still a prince confined to the cafes, a Georgian concubine named Shivakar became pregnant in violation of harem rules. Kösem Sultan ordered the Kızlar Ağa, eunuch named Sümbül Ağa, to drown her. Instead, Sümbül hid Shivakar in his own quarters, where she gave birth to a son named Osman. When Kösem discovered this, she exiled all 3 of them to Egypt. Their ship was attacked by the Knights of Malta, and Shivakar and her son were captured. Shivakar died in captivity. Her son was raised Christian on the island of Malta, under the name Domenico Ottomano, an Ottoman prince who grew up in a foreign country, never knowing the father who had been locked in a cage or the grandmother who had ordered his mother drowned. This was the system working normally. This was what passed for routine. Ibrahim's mother, Kösem, encouraged him to spend as much time as possible in the harem. This served two purposes. It kept Ibrahim distracted and out of state affairs, which Kösem preferred to manage herself, and it ensured that Ibrahim fathered heirs, which was critical, because he was the last surviving male of the Ottoman line. If he died without sons, 600 years of dynasty ended. Kösem personally went to the slave markets to select girls she thought would hold her son's attention. She knew his preferences. She studied what kept him calm and what triggered his rages. She curated the harem around him like a handler managing a dangerous animal. But the harem was not managed by Kösem alone. The machinery of daily control belonged to the eunuchs, and understanding the eunuch system is essential to understanding how the harem functioned, because these were the men who would carry out the drawings. The eunuchs of the Ottoman harem were boys taken from East Africa, primarily from Abyssinia, Nubia, and the Upper Nile Valley. They were captured through slave raids at around 7 or 8 years old, transported by caravan through Sudan to Cairo, and castrated there by specialized operators, often Coptic monks, in a procedure that involved complete removal. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Historians estimate that only 10 to 20% of boys survived the operation. Those who lived through it were healed over several months, and then shipped to Constantinople, where their rarity made them extraordinarily valuable. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Kızlar Ağa, the chief black eunuch, formerly titled the Egg of the House of Felicity. He held the rank of Pasha and was the third most powerful official in the entire Ottoman Empire, behind only the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. He controlled every entrance and exit of the harem. He decided which women the Sultan saw and when. He managed the finances, supervised the education of the princes, organized festivals and ceremonies, and served as the sole intermediary between the Grand Vizier and the Sultan. No minister, not even the Grand Vizier himself, could enter the harem without the Kızlar Ağa's permission. At the peak of the system in the 17th century, the harem employed between 800 and 1,200 eunuchs. They stood at every door. They accompanied every woman who moved from one section of the harem to another. They listened to every conversation. And when a woman violated the rules, it was the eunuchs who administered punishment. For lesser offenses, beatings. For serious offenses, exile. For the gravest offense of all, drowning in the Bosphorus. It was the Kızlar Ağa himself who sued the Sakshut. Ibrahim took to the harem with an intensity that disturbed even his handlers. He was reputed to take 24 different concubines in a single day. Over the course of 7 years, his concubines bore him 18 children. He had mirrors installed on the walls and ceilings of his private chambers, so he could watch himself. The Moldavian chronicler Dimitri Cantemir, a soldier and statesman who documented Ottoman court life from direct observation, recorded that Ibrahim would assemble all the women in the palace gardens, order them to strip, and then run among them, neighing like a stallion. He drenched palace furnishings in amber perfume, which is known to cause dizziness and disorientation in enclosed spaces. He adorned his beard with diamonds. He stuffed his pillows with sable fur. He once saw the hindquarters of a cow, and was so taken with the shape that he had a golden cast made, and sent it around the empire with instructions to find a woman whose body matched it. He developed an obsession with sable fur after one of his concubines told him a story about a sable king. Ibrahim sent agents to every corner of the empire to bring back sable. He lined entire palace walls with it. He had cats dressed in sable coats and paraded through the halls. He carpeted the palace of Ibrahim Pasha entirely in sable, and gave it to one of his wives, Teli Haseki. The cost was staggering, paid from a treasury already strained by the war in Crete and a Venetian naval blockade that was slowly starving Constantinople. But Ibrahim's most notorious obsession was with large women. He searched the empire for its heaviest woman. His agents found her, an Armenian from Constantinople named Shivkar, said to weigh over 300 pounds. Ibrahim became so infatuated with her that he elevated her to the rank of Haseki Sultan, showered her with wealth beyond what any concubine had received before, and declared her governor-general of Damascus, giving a former slave administrative authority over one of the greatest cities in the Ottoman world. He gave her the land and jewels that had belonged to his own sisters, humiliating Ottoman princesses, women of royal blood, to reward a woman he had purchased from a slave market. Ibrahim also once took a liking to the infant son of a slave woman, and began to prefer this unrelated child over his own firstborn son, Mehmed. When Mehmed's mother, Turhan, complained, Ibrahim flew into a rage, grabbed the toddler Mehmed from her arms, and threw him into a pool. The child would have drowned if a servant had not pulled him out. Mehmed survived with a permanent scar on his forehead. He was 3 years old. Shivkar, whom everyone called Sugar Cube, was not merely a favorite. She was a political operator. She whispered in Ibrahim's ear during the hours when his paranoia was strongest, in the early morning when he woke screaming from nightmares about the cafes. In the late evening, when the amber perfume thickened the air and his thoughts spiraled, she told him which women to trust and which to fear. She told him secrets real or invented about other concubines. And she used Ibrahim's paranoia, the deep and permanent paranoia of a man who had spent his formative years expecting to be murdered at any moment, to destroy anyone who threatened her position. When one concubine drew the Sultan's attention, Shivakar made sure the attention didn't last. When another gained influence, Shivakar planted doubt. She was not the first woman in harem history to rule through the Sultan's ear rather than his bed. She was simply the most dangerous because the Sultan she controlled was already broken. Ibrahim raised 8 concubines simultaneously to the rank of Hasaki royal consort, something no Sultan had ever done before, or would ever do again. The title had once been reserved for a single favored woman. Ibrahim debased it into a tool of extravagance, giving each of his 8 Hasakis land, wealth, servants, and political influence. He stripped his sisters and nieces of their property to fund these gifts. His mother Kosem watched this with growing alarm, not because of the cost, although the cost was ruinous, but because Ibrahim's concubines were beginning to exercise real political power. They influenced the appointment of provincial governors. They interfered with military decisions. They answered to no one except Ibrahim, and Ibrahim answered to no one at all. Kosem had survived decades of Ottoman court politics through intelligence and patience. She had outlived her husband, Ahmed. She had managed her son Murad's violent reign without being killed by it. She had kept Ibrahim alive in the cafes when Murad wanted him dead. She understood, with the clarity of a woman who had governed an empire from behind the walls of a harem, that the state could not be run by a man who lined rooms with fur and appointed concubines to provincial governorships. She also understood that Shivkar was the engine driving Ibrahim's worst impulses. So Kosem invited Shivkar to dinner. According to the English diplomat Paul Rycott, who documented Ottoman court life in extraordinary detail during this period, Kosem had Shivkar strangled during the meal. She then told Ibrahim that Sugar Cube had died suddenly of a violent illness. Ibrahim was devastated. He mourned her for weeks. He refused food. He wept in his sable-lined chambers. But Shivakar's death didn't solve the problem. It made it catastrophically worse. With Sugar Cube gone, Ibrahim's paranoia had no filter. There was no longer anyone whispering in his ear to direct his suspicions at specific targets. Instead, his suspicion turned everywhere at once. He became convinced that women throughout the harem were conspiring against him. He ordered investigations. He had women interrogated. The eunuchs conducted the questioning under his direct orders. No one confessed because there was nothing to confess. And this is where the story returns to that courtyard on a summer night in Constantinople. Because Shivkar was gone, but the damage she had done lived after her. Before her death, she had planted one final piece of poison in Ibrahim's mind. She told him that one of his concubines had been intimate with a man from outside the harem. She didn't say which one. She may not have known. She may have invented the entire story to keep Ibrahim dependent on her investigative abilities, never expecting that she would die before the matter was resolved. Ibrahim ordered the Kızlar Ağa to investigate. Women were questioned under threat and under pain. None could identify the guilty party because there may never have been one. Ibrahim's rage built for weeks, then months. He interrogated women personally. He demanded names. He received none. The eunuchs reported failure after failure. The investigation turned the entire harem into a place of terror, where every woman suspected every other woman of informing, and where the Sultan's shadow in a corridor was enough to make a room fall silent. And then one night, he made his decision. He ordered every woman in his harem gathered in the courtyard, 280 of them. Women he had taken to his bed, women who had borne his children, women who had spent years training in poetry and music and dance for the privilege of serving him. Women who had been torn from their families as children and shipped across seas they would never cross again. Women who had done nothing except exist inside a system they had never chosen to enter. All of them brought to the courtyard in darkness, barefoot on stone that was still warm from the day's heat. Some of them understood immediately. The women who had been in the harem longest, who had witnessed punishments before, who had seen the sacks used on individual women accused of specific crimes, recognized what was happening. The moment they saw the canvas piled against the wall, they began to cry. Others stood in confusion, still half asleep, not yet comprehending why they had been woken, or why the eunuchs, who had dressed them and fed them, and escorted them to the baths every morning, were now standing in rigid formation with their faces turned to stone. The youngest girls, some of them barely older than children, recent arrivals who had not yet finished their training, had never seen a drowning sack at all, and didn't know what the canvas was for. The eunuchs had prepared everything in advance. The sacks were canvas, large enough to contain a human body with room for the stones that would drag it to the bottom of the strait. The Kızlar Ağa, the chief black eunuch, the man who had overseen these women's daily lives for years, who had arranged their meals and supervised their education, and decided which ones the Sultan would see on any given night, who had managed their pregnancies and their illnesses and their arguments and their friendships, personally sewed the first sacks shut with a heavy needle and thread he carried for this purpose. The other eunuchs followed his example. They had been trained for this. Drowning in the Bosphorus was the standard method of execution for women who violated harem law. What made this night different was not the method, it was the scale. Each woman was placed inside a sack. Stones were added, heavy river stones, each one the size of a man's head, enough to ensure the sack would not float. The sack was sewn closed with the woman still alive inside it, still breathing, still able to feel the rough canvas against her skin and the weight of the stones pressing against her body. Then the sack was carried by eunuchs to the terrace, the same terrace where the Sultan sometimes stood in the evening to watch boats pass on the Bosphorus, and thrown over the wall into the water below. The Bosphorus at that point runs deep and fast. The current pulls southward toward the Sea of Marmara. A weighted sack sinks within seconds. The women inside had time to feel the cold water rush through the weave of the canvas, time to feel their bodies pulled downward by the stones, time to understand that the surface was moving away from them and that no one was going to pull them back. Drowning in an enclosed space takes between 2 and 4 minutes. The brain remains conscious for most of that time. Modern neuroscience confirms that drowning victims experience a cascade of panic, suffocation, and finally a reflexive inhalation of water that fills the lungs with fluid. There is nothing quick about it. There is nothing painless about it. 280 women experience this in sequence, one after another, sack after sack, over the course of a single night. Multiple sources from the period confirm the event. The Moldavian chronicler Cantemir documented it. European diplomats reported it. Ottoman court records reference it, though historians continue to debate whether the number 280 is precise or approximate. What is not debated is that it happened, that it was ordered by the Sultan, that it was carried out by the eunuchs, and that the evidence was found afterward. Accounts describe fishermen in the Bosphorus pulling weighted sacks from the water for days after the drownings. French divers working in the strait decades later reportedly found sacks still on the seafloor, weighted down by stones that had kept them in place long after the canvas had begun to rot. All but 1 or 2 women died. The survivors were spared either by accident or by specific intervention. One of the survivors was Turhan Hadis, a Ukrainian concubine who was the mother of Ibrahim's eldest son, Mehmed. She lived because killing the mother of the heir would have endangered the succession that kept the dynasty alive. Turhan Hadis survived the night. She remembered what happened. She remembered the sound of it, the splashing and the silence that followed. The eunuchs carrying sacks passed her in the darkness while she stood in the courtyard, knowing that the only reason she was still breathing was because of the child she had given the Sultan 3 years earlier. She would carry that memory for the rest of her life, and she would use it. Ibrahim continued to rule for another year after the drownings. He replaced the dead women with new ones, purchased from the same slave markets, transported along the same routes, trained in the same skills, installed in the same chambers where the previous occupants had slept the night before they were sewn into sacks. The harem refilled. The system continued. The eunuchs who had carried sacks to the terrace went back to their posts at the doors and resumed their duties as if nothing had changed, because within the logic of the system, nothing had. The Sultan's will was absolute. The women were property. Property could be disposed of and replaced. But outside the harem walls, Ibrahim's rule was collapsing. He had emptied the treasury through years of extravagant sable carpets and diamond beards and gifts to 8 simultaneous hassocks while the empire fought a war it couldn't afford. He had started a disastrous conflict with Venice over the island of Crete, a war that would drag on for 25 years and drain Ottoman resources for a generation. The Venetian navy blockaded the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to Constantinople, cutting off the capital's grain supply. Bread prices quadrupled. Markets emptied, taxes were raised again and again to fund Ibrahim's spending, and the money disappeared into the harem, while soldiers were unpaid and ordinary citizens went hungry. In 1647, Kösem Sultan and the Grand Vizier Salih Pasha attempted to depose Ibrahim and replace him with one of his young sons. The plot failed. Ibrahim had Salih Pasha executed and exiled his own mother from the harem, sending her to a garden estate outside the city. With Kösem gone, Ibrahim appointed a new, corrupt Grand Vizier who would let him do whatever he wanted, and resumed his life in the harem as the empire crumbled around him. But the forces gathering against Ibrahim were now too powerful to stop. In August of 1648, the Janissaries revolted. The elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, the men who had conquered half the known world, The most feared fighting force in Europe marched on the capital. They seized Ibrahim's Grand Vizier, Ahmed Pasha, in the streets of Constantinople. An angry mob strangled him and then tore his body apart so completely that he earned the posthumous nickname Hezarper, which means 1,000 pieces, not a metaphor, a description. On the 8th of August, Ibrahim was captured inside the palace and dragged back to the cage, the same rooms where he had spent 17 years of his childhood, listening to his brothers die. His 6-year-old son, Mem, the boy he had once thrown into a pool, was placed on the throne. Qasim was brought back from exile to serve as regent. 10 days later, the new Grand Vizier obtained a fatwa from the Shaykhul Islam, the highest religious authority in the empire, authorizing Ibrahim's execution. The ruling was delivered in a single sentence: if there are 2 caliphs, kill one of them. Qasim gave her consent to her own son's death. She said, "In the end, he will leave neither you nor me alive. We will lose control of the government. The whole society is in ruins. Have him removed from the throne immediately." 2 executioners came for Ibrahim in the cafes. One of them was his own former chief executioner, a man who had served under Ibrahim for years and carried out dozens of strangulations on his orders. When Ibrahim saw them approach, he understood what was happening. He began to scream. His last recorded words echo across 4 centuries. "Is there no one among those who have eaten my bread who will take pity on me and protect me? These cruel men have come to kill me. Mercy, mercy." His mother watched from a window of the palace as the executioners looped a silk bowstring around Ibrahim's neck and pulled it tight. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 8 years. He died the same way his brothers had died, the same way countless Ottoman princes and rivals and inconvenient women had died before them, strangled by the same empire that had created him, in the same cage where he had lost his mind. His death was the second regicide in Ottoman history. It would not be the last. The story didn't end with Ibrahim's death. The system that produced him continued to grind forward, consuming women and princes and eunuchs with the same mechanical efficiency it had maintained for centuries. His mother Qasim became regent for the 6-year-old Sultan Mehmed IV. She ruled the empire as she always had, through intelligence, manipulation, and strategic violence. But the harem she governed still operated by the same rules that had governed it before the drownings. Women still competed for power through the sultan's bed. Women still poisoned and strangled each other for position. Women still entered the system as kidnapped children from the Caucasus and left it only through death, or the rare mercy of a sultan who freed elderly concubines he no longer desired. The slave caravans still moved through Sudan and across the Black Sea. The eunuchs still stood at the doors. 3 years after Ibrahim's execution, Turhan Hadis, the concubine, who had survived the mass drowning, the woman who had stood in that courtyard and watched 8 of her companions carried to the terrace in sacks, moved against Qasim. Turhan was Mehed's mother. She wanted the regency for herself, and she wanted Qasim gone permanently. The conflict between the 2 women, grandmother and mother of the same child sultan, was the final act of a power struggle that had been building since the night of the drownings. On the 2nd of September, bin al-Tuzay-Libir, the chief black eunuch, Div Suleiman Ağa, was sent to find Qasim in the harem. The old woman who had survived her husband Sultan Ahmed, managed one violent son Murad, endured another mad son Ibrahim, consented to that mad son's execution, and governed an empire for more than 30 years, ran through the maze of corridors she knew better than anyone alive, stuffing jewels into her pockets as she fled. She knew every passage, every hidden door, every shortcut through the 400 rooms of the harem she had ruled for decades. It didn't save her. The eunuch caught her in a storage room. He strangled her by twisting her own braids around her neck. She was 62 years old. When the people of Constantinople heard that Qasim Sultan was dead, they closed the mosques and the bazaars for 3 days. The great Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi recorded her death with grief, calling her a gracious benefactress who was martyred. The people mourned the woman who had ordered her own son's execution. They did not mourn the woman her son had drowned. The 280 concubines were never mentioned in public mourning. They had no families in Constantinople to demand justice. They had no political allies to remember them. They had been property. And when property is destroyed, empires do not hold funerals. The harem at Topkapi Palace continued to operate for another 1050 years after the drownings. Sultans continued to acquire concubines from slave markets. Eunuchs continued to guard the doors. The Kafis continued to produce damaged men and hand them absolute power. The last concubines were set free in 1909 when Sultan Abdulhamid II was exiled to Salonika, and 370 women walked out of the gates. They had entered as children and saw the streets of Constantinople for the first time in their lives. 27 eunuchs walked out with them. Some of the freed women had spent 50 years inside. The palace was converted into a museum. The last known surviving eunuch of the Ottoman harem, a man named Sadi Ağa, was found by journalists in a cafe in the town of Tuzla in the Bindokaz's Ellis. When they asked him about his past, he refused to speak. "We have long forgotten the past," he said. "Let us focus on the present. We are uneducated people. What would we know anyway?" You can visit Topkapi today. You can walk through the corridors where women walked on that summer night nearly 400 years ago. You can see the courtyard of the favorites, the tiny windows of the cafes overlooking a large empty pool, the apartments where women lived and competed and died for centuries. You can stand on the terrace and look down at the Bosphorus at the same dark water where 280 weighted sacks sank to the bottom while the Sultan watched from somewhere inside the palace, and the eunuchs carried sack after sack to the edge. The current still runs. The water tells you nothing. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we believe the past deserves to be remembered, not sanitized, not romanticized, but told in its full, terrible truth. Was Ibrahim a monster, or was he the inevitable product of a system that locked children in cages and then handed that absolute power over hundreds of human lives? Could anyone have emerged sane from 17 years of imprisonment, watching their brothers be murdered one by one? Does understanding how he was broken excuse what he did to the women who had no more choice in being there than he did? Tell us what you think in the comments. If this story changed how you see the Ottoman Empire, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians if you haven't already. 280 women went into the water that night. Most of them had been taken from their homes as children. None of them were asked. None of them were charged with a crime. None of them were given a chance to speak. They were sewn into sacks by the men who had guarded them for years, carried to the edge of the terrace by the men who had fed them and dressed them and arranged their lives down to the smallest detail, and dropped into the dark water of the Bosphorus like stones. They didn't have names in the historical record. They were counted, not named. They were called the Sultan's women. But every one of them had a name once in a village somewhere before the slave traders came.